The moment I saw them walk through the gate without weapons, I stopped breathing. I know that sounds dramatic. I have processed delegations for 22 years. I have watched warlords enter the Grand Convocation Hall with ceremonial blades dripping with inlaid precious stones. I have seen the Sarathi bring full honor guard units, 8 soldiers deep, every one of them carrying a pulse lance that could split a shuttle in half. I have watched the Muhari Collective arrive with 4 automated defense spheres floating silently around their ambassador like small obedient moons. I have, in my career, become almost entirely immune to being surprised by the things that diplomats consider necessary to feel safe. But 6 humans walked through the security arch of Nexus Station's primary entry corridor, and not one of them was carrying anything. No sidearms, no blades, no shoulder-mounted disruptors, not even the small ceremonial stunners that most species consider the bare minimum for personal dignity. They wore dark uniforms, clean and well-fitted, with no insignia, beyond a small embroidered patch on the left shoulder. They carried themselves with a quiet, unhurried ease that I found, within the first 4 seconds, more unsettling than any weapon I had ever checked at a gate. My name is Velshara. I am a senior protocol attaché for the Galactic Council, which means it is my job to make sure that every diplomatic event that happens on Nexus Station runs exactly as planned. It is a job that requires precision, patience, and a very specific kind of calm that comes from knowing the rules so well that nothing surprises you. I had spent 22 years building that calm. The humans eroded it in less than a minute. I pulled up their delegation file on my data slate as they approached the secondary check-in station. 6 guards, all certified by the Human Confederacy's Diplomatic Protection Office. Lead guard, Sergeant Nathan Cole, age 34, 12 years of service. I read his service record, and then I read it again, because I was certain I had misunderstood something. I had not misunderstood anything. I set the slate down. My junior colleague, a young Theran named Drix 7, appeared at my elbow. He was watching the humans with the wide, bright eyes of someone who had never seen one up close before, and was not entirely sure what he was looking at. They forgot their weapons, he said, with the simple confidence of someone who had found the most obvious explanation, and was pleased with himself for finding it. I watched Sergeant Nathan Cole pause 3 steps inside the secondary corridor and look up at the environmental sensor cluster mounted near the ceiling. He did not look at it the way a delegate looks at the decor. He looked at it the way someone looks at something they are cataloging. His eyes moved from the sensor cluster to the emergency pressure door at the far end of the corridor, then to the side passage that led to the delegate lounge, then to the 2 Theran station guards posted near the reception desk. He looked at each of those things for approximately 1 second each. Then he looked back at the path ahead and kept walking. The whole thing took less than 5 seconds. It looked like nothing. It felt like watching someone read an entire room like a book and turn the last page before you had even found the first sentence. They did not forget, I said to Drix 7. He looked at me, confused. I did not explain further, because I did not yet have the words. What I had instead was a feeling, which is not something that belongs in a protocol report, but which I will set down here because it is the truest thing I can say about that moment. Standing in that corridor, watching those 6 humans walk toward me in their plain dark uniforms with their empty hands, I felt the particular kind of quiet that falls over a forest when something large begins to move through it. The Grand Convocation on Nexus Station had been organized over the course of 3 years. It was the largest diplomatic gathering the Galactic Council had hosted in a generation, with 47 active member civilizations sending full delegations and 7 observer species attending for the first time. The Human Confederacy fell into that second category. They had been invited to every major council event for the past 30 years, and had declined every single one, politely and without explanation, until 6 months ago, when their Undersecretary for External Relations, a woman named Marin Cole, had sent a brief message to the council chair, accepting the invitation to the convocation. That message had caused considerable discussion in the council's internal channels. Humans were not unknown to the galactic community. They had been making contact with neighboring species for nearly a century, and in that time they had managed to negotiate 14 trade agreements, end 2 interstellar border conflicts that had been running for longer than humans had possessed space travel, and establish a reputation for producing diplomats who were, by universal consensus, unnervingly good at their jobs. What humans had not done, in all that time, was join anything. They sent representatives. They negotiated. They shook whatever appendage a given species extended toward them in greeting. And then they went home. The fact that they were here, at the convocation, attending as observers with a full delegation, was the single most discussed topic among the Council's member civilizations in the weeks before the event. I had overheard approximately 47 distinct theories about what it meant, ranging from the optimistic to the deeply suspicious. What no one had discussed, because no one had thought to ask, was what their guards would look like when they arrived. I met Undersecretary Marin Cole at the reception desk, with my most professional composure in place. She was a tall woman with light brown hair that she wore pulled back in a simple knot, and she shook my hand with a firm, brief grip and thanked me for the welcome in perfectly accented High Theron, which was not a language that humans typically bothered to learn. I noted that detail and filed it away. She introduced her delegation, 2 senior diplomatic advisors, a cultural liaison, a language specialist, and a technical aide. And then she turned slightly and said, with the ease of someone performing the most routine action in the world, my security team, led by Sergeant Nathan Cole. Sergeant Cole stepped forward and inclined his head in the Theron gesture of respectful acknowledgement, which was not a gesture that humans typically knew, and said, in clear standard galactic, "Thank you for having us." His voice was calm and even, and he smiled in a way that was pleasant and entirely unrevealing. I completed the check-in process on automatic, because the part of my brain that handles routine tasks was still functioning normally, while the rest of it was occupied with a question I could not quite form. I stamped their credentials, assigned their quarters, handed over the welcome materials, and walked the delegation toward the primary hall. I was 3 steps ahead, guiding them through the connecting corridor, when I realized that I could not hear the guards behind me. I do not mean that they were quiet. I mean that 6 adult beings, walking on a hard station floor, were producing less sound than I would have expected from one. I turned on the pretense of checking the corridor directional display, and I looked back at them. They were walking normally. Their posture was easy. Their pace was unhurried. Their arms were at their sides. They were not doing anything unusual. And yet something about the way they moved struck me as deeply considered, in a way I could not immediately name. They were spread, I noticed then, not clustered. Sergeant Cole was 2 paces to the left of the Undersecretary and 1 pace behind. 1 guard was forward left, keeping a clear line of sight to the junction ahead. 1 was at the rear, moving slightly sideways so that she could watch the corridor behind without appearing to turn her head. The other 3 were positioned between and around the delegation in a pattern that looked casual until you noticed that every angle was covered. They were moving through a perfectly safe, well-monitored, neutral station corridor, as if they had already identified every possible problem it might contain, and had already decided what they would do about each one. I turned back to face the corridor ahead and kept walking. I did not look back again. The first session of the convocation began that evening in the Grand Hall, which is the largest interior space on Nexus Station. The hall is a wide, circular chamber with tiered seating arranged around a central floor, and the ceiling is made of transparent composite material that looks out into the dark between stars. It is a beautiful room. The Council's architects designed it specifically to make delegates feel the appropriate combination of importance and humility that good diplomacy requires. The human guards took up positions around the Undersecretary at the delegation table and did not move from those positions for the next 4 hours. I watched them, on and off, throughout the opening session. It was unprofessional of me, I know. I had my own duties to attend to, monitoring the session feed, coordinating with the hall staff, fielding small crises from 3 different delegations who had complaints about their seating, but I kept coming back to the guards. They stood still in a way that I found difficult to look away from. It was not the stillness of boredom or inattention. Every delegate has bored guards who stand in a corner and let their focus drift, because nothing interesting ever happens at a diplomatic session and they know it. This was entirely different. These guards were still in the way that a held breath is still. Everything in their posture suggested an absolute awareness of the room that they were simply choosing not to act on. Ambassador Kreeth of the Sarathi Dominion spoke for 40 minutes on the subject of revised trade tariffs, and then, as was his custom, he rose to his full height at the end and slammed both hands on the table to emphasize his final point. Kreeth was large even by Sarathi standards, and this particular habit of his had produced flinching responses from delegates of 9 different species over the years. I had seen it happen many times. You never quite got used to the sound. Every person at the table reacted. Subtle reactions, controlled, professional, but reactions nonetheless. A slight shift in posture, a quick blink, a barely perceptible lean away from the sound. Undersecretary Cole did not move at all. Neither did her guards. Sergeant Cole, standing 2 paces behind her left shoulder, did something in that moment that I replayed in my memory many times afterward. When Kreeth's hands hit the table, Cole's gaze moved. Not to Kreeth, not to the table, to the space around Kreeth. The door behind him, the delegate seated at his left, the corridor exit 12 meters to the east, and then back to the room as a whole. The movement took less than 2 seconds. Then he was still again. Kreeth was still speaking, working up to his dramatic conclusion. He turned slightly, projecting his voice toward the chamber at large, and his eyes swept past the human delegation, the way a speaker's eyes sweep past things they are not particularly focused on. They paused. Just for a fraction of a second, they paused on Sergeant Cole. And then Kreeth finished his statement, sat down, and did not rise dramatically again for the rest of the session. I had watched Kreeth address the council 17 times. He had never in my memory ended a statement without the theatrical rise and the deliberate sweeping eye contact that was his signature move. Something had stopped him. I had no official explanation for what that something was. After the session, I filed my routine report and added a personal note at the bottom, flagged for my own reference only. The note said, "Human guards, no weapons, no visible equipment, positioning deliberate, awareness high, follow-up." I looked at that note for a moment, and then added 3 more words at the end. Ambassador Kreeth noticed. I saved the file, and went to find Drix 7, because I needed someone to talk to, and he was the only one available. I found him in the staff corridor outside the hall, eating a bowl of spiced grain, and looking perfectly content with the world. "The humans," I said. He nodded. "They were fine. No incidents. I told you they just forgot their weapons. Probably embarrassed about it. I thought they seemed very polite." I looked at him for a moment. "Drix," I said carefully, "have you ever stood very close to something large, in the dark, and had the feeling that it was looking at you?" He thought about it. "On my home colony. Yes. Once. There was a ground predator that came too close to the settlement perimeter. We could not see it, but we could feel it." "What did you do?" "We went inside," he said, very quickly. "Yes," I said. "That is the feeling. That is exactly the feeling." Drix 7 looked at me, and then he looked down the corridor toward the guest quarters where the human delegation had gone, and then he looked back at me. He was quiet for a moment. "But they were so polite," he said. "Yes," I said, "they were." I went back to my office, and I did something that I had not done in years. I went through the historical records of every delegation that had ever shared a diplomatic space with humans. Not the official records, the personal ones. The written accounts and private memos and margin notes that sometimes get archived in the secondary stacks and forgotten. I read for 3 hours. In 2291, a Dravathi trade delegation had reportedly refused to continue a negotiation session with a human representative until the 2 human advisors present agreed to move to the far end of the room. The Dravathi delegation head had given no reason. The human advisors had moved without complaint. The negotiation had proceeded. In the archived margin note written by the council observer present at that meeting, someone had written, "Unknown what caused Dravathi discomfort. Human advisors unarmed, unthreatening in appearance. Dravathi still clearly uncomfortable. Session successful." In 2298, a Muhari border commission had broken down and nearly collapsed entirely when a human liaison officer had stood up from his seat to retrieve a document from a shelf. 3 Muhari delegates had begun moving toward the exits. The liaison officer had retrieved his document and sat back down without comment, and the Muhari delegates had returned to the table and, when asked about the incident later, had said they were unsure what had happened. One of them had used a word that translated roughly as wrong-footed, and then declined to elaborate. In 2304, a Velthran diplomatic journal had published an anonymous piece by someone who described themselves as a veteran of 11 multi-species negotiations. The piece was titled, in translation, on the particular quality of human stillness, and it was 3 pages long and never quite arrived at a conclusion, but it noted, with considerable unease, that humans in a formal setting produced in the author a persistent sensation of being in the presence of something that was making a continuous, active decision about what it was doing. The author wrote, "They are always choosing. You can feel it. Every movement is chosen. Every stillness is chosen. There is no such thing as an accidental human." I set down my data slate and looked at the ceiling of my office. Tomorrow the convocation would move into its first working sessions, real negotiations, real pressure. A room full of 47 civilizations, with competing interests and centuries of complex history between them, and 6 humans, standing quietly at the edges of it, carrying nothing but themselves. I thought about what the Velthran author had written, every movement chosen, every stillness chosen. I thought about Sergeant Cole's eyes moving to the exits when Creeth slammed his hands on the table, not to Creeth, to the exits first, to the shape of the situation, already thinking 2 steps beyond what was happening, to what could happen, to what would happen if it did, to what he would do then. I thought about the forest quiet. I straightened my desk and prepared my materials for the morning session, and told myself I was being imaginative. 22 years of protocol work does not make you paranoid. It makes you careful. There was a difference. I believed that, going to sleep that night. By the end of the following week, I was not so sure. I had one more thought before sleep took me, and it was this. Every species in that hall tomorrow would be watching their neighbors for signs of advantage and disadvantage, reading postures and tones, and the subtle language of who sat where, and who stood when, and who conceded first. They would all be doing it, and they would all believe they were the most skilled at it, and most of them would be wrong about that. And the 6 humans standing quietly along the far wall would watch all of them doing it, and say nothing, and give nothing away, and their hands would remain empty, and that emptiness would say everything that needed to be said. I closed the light in my office. Outside, the stars were very still. Nexus Station turned slowly in the dark, carrying its 47 civilizations and its 6 quiet humans, and somewhere in the guest wing, I was fairly certain that Sergeant Nathan Cole was not yet asleep. I was fairly certain he was doing exactly what he had been doing in the corridor on their arrival, looking at everything, cataloging it, deciding nothing yet, ready for a morning that had not arrived, ready for something that might never happen. Ready the way only a thing that has been ready its entire life can be ready, with no effort and no drama, just that constant, quiet, chosen alertness that I was already beginning to think was the most honest thing humans ever showed to the galaxy. I slept poorly. I did not think that was going to change anytime soon. The security feed does not lie. That is the first thing they teach you when you take a post like mine, and it is the one lesson I have never needed to be reminded of. I have been security chief of Nexus Station for 11 years, and in that time, I have reviewed hundreds of thousands of hours of recorded footage. I have watched things happen on those feeds that I would not have believed if someone had described them to me. I have solved incidents that everyone else called accidents, and prevented ones that everyone else called impossible. I trust my feeds. I trust what they show me. I trust the data they produce. I did not, for the first 48 hours of the convocation, trust what the feeds were telling me about the human guards. My name is Commander Yisra. I am Velthari, which means I stand slightly shorter than most species at formal gatherings, and have to work somewhat harder to be taken seriously, which I have found to be excellent training for a career in security. Underestimation is a gift, if you are patient enough to use it correctly. I have been patient for 11 years, and I have built a security apparatus on this station that has not had a serious incident in the last 7 of them. I mention this not to praise myself, but to establish that I know what I am looking at when I am looking at it. What I was looking at, from the moment the human delegation arrived, was something I did not have a category for. Standard security monitoring for a delegation guest assigns a biometric tracking ID to each individual. The system pulls continuous readings, heart rate, body temperature, respiration rate, cortisol output, pupil dilation in low light conditions, micro-movement patterns. It is not a perfect system. Different species produce different baselines, and the software has to be calibrated accordingly. But for species we have had on the station before, it is reliable enough that I can tell you, with reasonable accuracy, whether a delegate is anxious, aggressive, tired, or lying during any given moment of any given session. I ran the biometric profiles on all 6 human guards within the first hour of their arrival. Then I ran them again, because I thought the calibration was off. Sergeant Nathan Cole, heart rate, 51 beats per standard minute. That was low even for a resting human. He was not resting. He was standing at the edge of a room, containing 47 foreign dignitaries and their armed escort details, in a station he had never visited before, during the most significant diplomatic gathering in a generation. Cortisol output was at baseline. Pupil response was elevated but steady, indicating high alertness without the physiological edge that comes with stress. His micro-movement patterns were what the system flagged as atypical. The reason it flagged them was that they were too controlled. The software expected a certain amount of unconscious micro-movement, the small shifts of weight and posture that all beings produce without thinking about it. Cole's were present, but each one followed a pattern that the system could not categorize because it was not random. He was making small positional adjustments, and every one of them was oriented toward something. The system kept trying to determine what, and kept failing. I recalibrated for the other 5 guards. Same result. All of them were producing the physiological profile of beings who were deeply focused, without any of the accompanying stress response that deep focus usually creates. They were not tense. They were not anxious. They were not demonstrating any of the standard indicators of a threat posture. They were demonstrating the indicators of beings who were in an environment they had already fully assessed and were now simply managing. That was the word that occurred to me and would not leave. Managing. They were managing the room. All of it. Every delegate, every exit, every guard detail from every other species, every piece of furniture, every corridor junction visible from their position. They were not concerned about it. They were not afraid of it. They were simply aware of it in the way that experienced predators are aware of their surroundings, not because anything dangerous is present, but because awareness is the state they default to. It requires no extra effort. It is simply what they are. I filed a preliminary report and flagged it for my superior's attention. She read it, came to find me in the monitoring room, reviewed the feed for 4 minutes, and told me I was pattern matching, where no pattern existed. Humans were a nervous species, she said, known for being high-strung. The biometric readings probably reflected some calibration issue with the alien physiology. She recommended I keep an eye on it and not make it a formal incident without more concrete cause. She was not wrong that it was not a formal incident. She was wrong that I would let it go. I kept watching. On the second day, there was a moment in the afternoon session that I have since reviewed more times than I can count. Ambassador Kreeth of the Sarathi Dominion was making his standard case for revised import duties, and somewhere in the middle of it, he reached across the table for a data tablet, and his elbow knocked his water vessel off the edge. It fell. In the split second between the vessel leaving the table and hitting the floor, every conscious being in that hall reacted. Every one of them. The reactions varied. Some delegates flinched, some turned their heads, some simply refocused their gaze, but there was a universal, involuntary response to the unexpected sound and motion. Every being reacted. One human guard did not. She was standing at the right forward position behind the undersecretary, a young woman named Corporal Lucy Grant, and she did not flinch, did not shift, did not redirect her gaze. Not because she had not heard it. Her pupil dilation spiked fractionally in the instant before the vessel hit, which told me she had registered the sound in the same moment as everyone else. But her body had not responded with surprise. It had, instead, produced what I can only describe as a very brief intensification of her existing focus. Something in the room had changed and she had registered it, assessed it, and decided, in the space of a single breath, that it was not a concern. Then she was still again. I flagged that clip separately. I watched it in slow motion. I watched the assessment happen in her eyes. One event, loud, unexpected sound, object falling in the peripheral zone. One response, brief data gathering, single evaluative pause, dismissal. All of it done so quickly and so quietly that anyone who was not specifically looking for it would have seen nothing at all. They would have seen a guard who did not react. They would have assumed she had not noticed. She had noticed. She had simply already decided what it was before her body had time to react to it. That distinction matters enormously, and it took me most of that second day to articulate why. Every other guard in that hall, from every other species, operated on a model that went roughly like this. Stimulus happens, body responds, mind evaluates, decision made. The physical reaction came before the assessment. That is how nervous systems work. That is how security personnel are trained to manage their instincts, by reducing the delay between stimulus and appropriate response, shortening the loop. The human guards were running a different loop, something closer to, mind evaluates continuously, body stays ready, stimulus happens, mind already knows what it is, body does only exactly what the mind has already decided is necessary. The assessment was not happening after the stimulus. It was happening before, all the time, in advance, constantly. It was, I realized, the difference between a guard who was trained to respond quickly and a guard who had so fully internalized their environment that responses had become something closer to conclusions. I did not sleep well that night. On the third day, I expanded my monitoring parameters and started pulling behavioral correlation data from the full 6-guard team. I wanted to see how they communicated with each other, because every security team communicates. They have earpieces, hand signals, subtle code words, some system of internal coordination. I expected to find theirs within a few hours. I could not find it. They did not use visible hand signals. I was certain of that. I watched every frame at reduced speed and mapped every hand movement against standard Terran signaling codes. Nothing matched. They were not using earpieces, which I had confirmed by scanning for the relevant frequencies during the first session. They did not, as far as I could determine, exchange any words at all during working hours beyond the minimum necessary for basic courtesy. And yet their positioning in the room shifted over the course of each session in a way that was clearly coordinated. When one guard adjusted, another adjusted in complement. When the undersecretary moved to speak with a neighboring delegate, the guard coverage redistributed fluidly, without any visible signal, in a pattern that maintained full situational coverage from every angle. I brought in my senior analyst, a sharp-minded Athene named Sorn, and showed him the coverage pattern data without telling him where it was from. I asked him what he thought produced it. He studied the data for a while. Practice team, he said. Years of working together, they've built up a shared internal model of what correct positioning looks like. They don't need to signal because they already know where everyone else should be in any given configuration. Like a trained unit, I said. More organic than that, he said. Like a family that has lived in the same house for a long time. You know where everyone moves. You know without looking. I thanked him and he left, and I sat with that for a moment. A family that has lived in the same house. Knowing where everyone moves. Knowing without looking. But these 6 people had met, according to their personnel files, no more than 2 years before this mission. Nathan Cole and Lucy Grant had served on a previous assignment together. The others had not. They were not a unit with a decade of shared deployment. They were 6 individuals assembled into a team, and yet they were moving through this space like something that had been together far longer than that. Unless the thing they shared was not time but training. Unless they had all been taught to think in the same way so completely that the team model built itself, regardless of who the individuals were. I pulled the human diplomatic guard training documentation, which was partially available in the Council's public records database. Partially available because, as I discovered, significant sections were marked restricted, accessible only by authorized human government parties. What I could access covered the first 18 months of the training program and described it in terms that were, on the surface, entirely unremarkable. Physical conditioning, language study, cultural briefings, threat assessment theory, emergency response protocols, standard material. Every species with a diplomatic guard program has roughly equivalent material. What was not standard was the duration. 48 months of mandatory training before a guard was considered field certified. 4 years. For comparison, the Sarathi, who are widely considered to run one of the most rigorous protection programs in the known galaxy, certify their guards in 14 months. I made a note of that and went looking for the curriculum breakdown for the final 30 months of the human program. Those records were in the restricted section. I submitted a formal access request through council channels and was told, courteously and without elaboration, that the requested records were not available to non-human parties under the Human Confederacy's current diplomatic disclosure agreements. I wrote back and explained that I was security chief of the station, currently hosting their delegation, and that the request was relevant to standard operational security procedures. The reply was courteous, brief, and entirely identical to the first one. I set that aside and went back to my feeds, because the feeds were still running, and something in the main corridor had shifted. It was late in the third evening, and most of the delegates had returned to their quarters. The corridor outside the primary meeting rooms was quiet, staffed by 2 of my officers, and monitored by 4 ceiling-mounted sensors. The human delegation was returning from a private dinner with the council liaison team. Undersecretary Cole, her 2 senior advisors, the cultural liaison, and the 6 guards, moving in easy formation through the corridor. Coming from the opposite direction, returning from the station's observation lounge, was a group of 3 Dravathi soldiers attached to the hegemony's delegation. They were large beings, the Dravathi, built in a way that makes most other species reconsider whatever path they were on. These 3 were security personnel, off-duty, and they moved with the loose, unhurried confidence of beings who have never in their lives found a corridor too small for them. The 2 groups met in the junction near Corridor 7. There was a moment, perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps 4, in which the 2 groups occupied the same general space. My feed caught all of it. The Dravathi did not stop. They continued through the junction, giving way slightly to allow the Undersecretary's group to pass. Standard corridor courtesy, nothing remarkable. Except that the lead Dravathi soldier, a senior-ranked individual named Harkon whom I knew by face from the delegation roster, slowed fractionally as he passed. I almost missed it, a slight reduction in pace, so brief it could have been nothing. His eyes moved, as they passed each other, to Sergeant Cole. Cole met the look with the same expression he wore every moment of every day in that station, calm, aware, and entirely revealing of nothing. Harkon looked away first. He kept walking. His 2 subordinates, who had not slowed, were already 3 paces ahead of him. I flagged that clip too. I flagged it because of what the biometric feed showed in that 4-second window. Harkon's cortisol output spiked. Just briefly. Just enough. It was the spike that accompanies a sudden, involuntary recalculation, the body's way of saying that something in the environment did not match expectations, and that a response may be required. It resolved almost immediately, as he continued through the junction and away. Nathan Cole's biometric readings did not change at all. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling of my monitoring room. I was aware, with a clarity that I found genuinely uncomfortable, that I had just watched something happen that I could not fully explain. A Dravathi security officer, elite-trained, experienced, entirely accustomed to being the most physically imposing presence in any given space, had looked at an unarmed human standing in a corridor, and had, at a level below conscious thought, been surprised by what he had seen. Surprised, and then cautious. I wrote up that clip, added it to my personal file, and began drafting a second report. This one I flagged, not for my superior, but for the Council's Security Committee, because I was increasingly of the view that what I was observing was not a calibration issue, and not a coincidence, and not my imagination. I was observing something that the galactic community did not have a proper framework for, because we had spent decades measuring human capability in terms of what humans carried, and what they could deploy, and what technologies they had developed, and what their warships could do in an engagement. We had never, as far as I could find in any document, seriously attempted to measure what a human being produced simply by being present in a room. I sent the report. Then I poured a small amount of the strong beverage my predecessor had left in the monitor room cabinet, which I had never previously touched in 11 years of occupation. I drank it slowly, watching the feeds. The corridor was quiet now. The human delegation had reached their quarters. My 2 officers were back at their post. Everything was orderly and calm and under control. Somewhere in the guest wing, 6 humans were most likely doing whatever humans do when they are off duty. I did not, somehow, think that Sergeant Cole was fully off duty. I suspected, with no evidence and complete certainty, that he was not the kind of person who had an off position that engaged automatically at the end of a shift. I hoped, very sincerely, that we would not have cause to find out if I was right. 3 days later I found out. And I want to be precise about this. I did not find out because I was watching. I found out because my own security system, the one I had built and calibrated and trusted for 11 years, captured something that I had not anticipated capturing, and did not initially know how to classify. I found out because 4 large beings who should have known better decided that the word unarmed meant the same thing as the word defenseless, and in doing so, taught an entire station a lesson that none of us were going to forget. But that comes later. First, I need to tell you what happened in the meeting room on the morning of the 4th day, because it is the thing that, in retrospect, set everything in motion and explains why what happened in that corridor was not an accident. It was a demonstration, not a deliberate one, the most unsettling kind. The morning session had barely started when I noticed that the biometric reads on all 6 human guards had shifted in a way I had not seen before. Still no elevated stress, still no cortisol. But the micro-movement patterns had changed. They were smaller, more compact. Each guard had, without any visible signal and without any apparent cause that I could identify, moved into a configuration that my system flagged as compressed high alert. I did not know that category. I had to look it up. It did not appear in any of my standard references. I found it, finally, in an old Sarathi military document describing the pre-engagement postures of certain predatory fauna. The description read, "A shortening of behavioral range consistent with imminent action. Subject is not yet moving. Subject has decided to be ready to move." I looked up from that document to my feed. I looked at the room. Nothing visible had changed. The session was proceeding. Delegates were speaking. The undersecretary was taking notes. I pulled the previous 40 minutes of corridor and adjacent room feeds and started looking for whatever had changed. It took me 22 minutes to find it. A brief exchange, captured by audio feed in the corridor outside the meeting room before the session began. 2 voices, one belonging to a Dravathi junior attaché, speaking in quick hegemony dialect, and one I could not identify, speaking in a lower register, also in Dravathi. The audio quality was poor. I had to run it through 2 filters. What came through was partial, and what came through was enough. The word that repeated twice, clearly, was the Dravathi word for the junior diplomat, Undersecretary Cole's cultural liaison. Her name was Petra Graves, and she was 26 years old, and she had been assigned to this delegation 3 months before the convocation. Someone was discussing her. Someone with a plan. The human guards had heard it before I had, somehow. Through the door, through the ambient noise of a station corridor in the morning, before the audio system had flagged it for my attention, they had heard something, or felt something, or simply known, with the particular kind of knowing that comes from 200,000 years of being the apex of a food chain, that the atmosphere in the space around them had changed. And they had gotten quiet, and small, and ready. I was on the comm to my response team before the session had ended. I told them to be near Corridor 7. I did not yet know why. I told them anyway. I had learned, in 11 years of this work, to trust the feeling. The feeling had never been this loud before. They came to me because they had run out of other people to ask. That is, in my experience, how it almost always begins. I am an archivist, which means I exist at the very end of the chain of inquiry. I am the place people arrive when the databases have returned nothing useful, when the specialists have offered their best theories and been found wanting, and when someone in a position of authority has run out of patience and decided that history must have an answer, because history has every other kind of answer. My job is to find what other people have stopped looking for. My name is Pell. I am Muandai, which means I process information through what your species might call a distributed nervous system, and I can hold a very large number of simultaneous data streams in active consideration, without losing resolution on any of them. This makes me a good archivist. It also means I experience the sensation of being alarmed across a much wider surface area than most beings, which is relevant to what I am about to tell you, because by the time I had spent 4 days inside the human records, I was alarmed in a way that involved essentially my entire body. The request came from the Council's Security Committee, routed through my department head as a priority research task. The question was simple. Why do human diplomatic guards carry no weapons to formal meetings? The assumption embedded in the question was that there was a bureaucratic explanation, a treaty clause perhaps, or an administrative policy that had been established at some point and never revisited. They wanted a source document, a date, a name, They wanted the kind of answer that could be put in a memo and filed and pointed to when the question was asked again. They did not get that kind of answer. I started, as I always do, with the public record. The Human Confederacy maintains an official archive of its diplomatic history that is accessible to council member parties under the standard transparency protocols. It is extensive, reasonably well organized, and, I discovered within the first hour, conspicuously incomplete in several key areas. Not dishonestly so. There is no evidence that the humans have deliberately withheld or falsified anything in the public record. But there are gaps, places where the documentation thins, or becomes vague, or references internal sources that are not included. And those gaps, when I mapped them, described a shape. The shape they described was the Cascadia incident of 2271. Cascadia was not a place in space. It was a city. A human city on a mid-sized human colony world. And what happened there has been referenced in exactly 4 documents in the publicly accessible Human Diplomatic Archive, each reference brief and factual, and stripped of anything that would tell you what it felt like to be there. I will tell you what I was able to piece together. In the spring of 2271, a human diplomatic convoy was traveling through the Cascadia Metropolitan District, on its way to a regional peace conference. The convoy consisted of 4 vehicles carrying 6 diplomats, their staff, and an armed protection detail of 8 soldiers. The peace conference was attempting to resolve a long-running territorial dispute between 2 human colonial factions, which I understand had been ongoing for approximately 9 years. It was not a small dispute. People had been harmed, significant numbers of people. The kind of dispute where both sides have convinced themselves that the only path forward is the complete capitulation of the other. The convoy was ambushed in the 2nd District. The ambush was organized, well-resourced, and designed specifically to prevent the conference from taking place. The protection detail responded with their weapons, as they were trained to do, as they were expected to do. The crossfire lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, 9 of the 12 individuals in the convoy were dead, 4 of the 8 armed guards. All 6 diplomats except one, who survived only because she had been thrown from her vehicle in the first moments, and had lain still beneath it until the shooting ended. The attackers withdrew with their own casualties into the urban landscape, and were not, from what I can find in the public record, ever fully accounted for. The sole surviving diplomat was a woman named Clara Harmon. She was 31 years old at the time, and she had been a junior trade attaché for 3 years, and after the Cascadia incident, she became the most significant figure in the complete restructuring of human diplomatic protection doctrine. She lived to the age of 94, and gave one recorded interview about what had happened in that district, when she was 87, which I found in the secondary archive stacks, and which took me 2 days to locate, because it had been filed under her married name, and cross-referenced only under a tag that translated, roughly, as Incident Survivor Retrospectives. In that interview, she said the following, and I am going to render it as closely as I can to her original words, because they matter. The guns made us a battle. The moment our guards returned fire, we were a battle. We were something that had 2 sides, and the people who ambushed us had planned for a battle. They were ready for a battle. What they were not ready for was nothing. What they were not ready for was people who could not be fought with weapons, because the people weren't carrying any. You can't shoot at someone who isn't shooting back, and sustain it for 11 minutes, and feel like you've won anything. But they didn't have to. They just had to wait us out. And our guards gave them something to shoot at, and they did. She paused in the interview, and the recording captured nearly 20 seconds of silence before she continued. I asked myself for years what would have happened if the guards had not returned fire. I know people think that's a terrible thought, like I'm criticizing people who died trying to protect us. I'm not. They did exactly what they were trained to do. But I could not stop asking, what if the training was the problem? What if the guns told the other side that we were a military problem and not a diplomatic one? What if we arrived at a peace conference protected by the evidence that we did not actually believe peace was possible? The interview ends there. The researcher conducting it thanked her and the recording stops. I sat with that for a long time. Then I went looking for what happened after Cascadia. The restructuring of the diplomatic guard program began 14 months after the incident, under a joint commission that included Clara Harmon as its civilian advisor. The commission spent 8 months reviewing protection doctrine, incident records from the preceding 40 years, and what the report calls Behavioral Science Literature on Threat De-Escalation and Presence-Based Deterrence. The final report is 112 pages long, and the first 11 of those pages are available in the public archive. The remaining 101 pages are classified. The 11 public pages contain the new doctrine's foundational principle, stated in clear and straightforward language. The function of diplomatic protection is not to match a threat in kind. The function of diplomatic protection is to remove the threat's context for escalation. An armed guard transforms a diplomat into a combatant. An unarmed guard transforms an ambush into an assault on a civilian. These are not equivalent situations, and the history of diplomatic security makes clear which one produces better outcomes for the protected party. That is the official reasoning. That is what the public record gives you. I filed it in my notes, and then I kept going. Because I have been an archivist for 37 years, and I know the difference between the reason a policy is officially described and the reason a policy actually works. The reason it works is in the restricted sections. I could not access those sections directly, but I could find their edges, and the edges told me enough. The Human Diplomatic Guard program, post-Cascadia, was redesigned around a concept that appears in the accessible literature under several different names. The most common is presence-based deterrence. Another version calls it embodied authority. One document, authored by a human behavioral scientist named Dr. Alan Marsh in 2283, calls it, in a phrase I find both precise and unsettling, the cost of engagement. Dr. Marsh's paper is available in full because it was published in a civilian academic journal before the Guard program formally adopted his framework. I read it 3 times. His central argument is this: the reason that weapons are poor deterrents in close protection scenarios is not that they lack stopping power, but that they define the nature of a potential conflict before it begins. A weapon says, if you start something, this is how it will go. It sets the terms. The problem with setting terms is that it allows the other party to evaluate those terms and decide whether they can work with them. Some threats, he argues, will look at an armed guard and calculate whether they can overcome that specific weapon. A sufficiently motivated or sufficiently resourced threat will sometimes conclude that they can. An unarmed guard who has been trained in Dr. Marsh's model does not set terms. An unarmed guard presents no calculable proposition. Instead, such a guard presents what he calls irreducible uncertainty. The threat cannot evaluate what they are dealing with, because there is nothing concrete to evaluate. There is only a person, standing between them and their target, and that person appears completely at ease, and the threat does not know why. Dr. Marsh writes, uncertainty is a more powerful deterrent than any weapon, because it cannot be overcome with better weapons. You cannot bring enough firepower to resolve the question of what you are actually facing, and a guard who has internalized 36 months of close-range threat response across multiple gravity environments and 17 species-specific combat paradigms, who has been trained to read behavioral microsignals so accurately that they know what you are going to do before you do, who has been conditioned to operate without stress response in high-threat environments, and who presents no weapon and no visible threat posture, is a guard who generates exactly the uncertainty I am describing. They are not non-threatening. They are threatening in a way that cannot be measured or addressed in advance. He ends the paper with a sentence that I have now read possibly 40 times. The empty hand, when it belongs to the right person, is the most honest threat assessment tool in existence. It says, I have decided you are not a problem. It also says, I am the one who gets to decide. I submitted my preliminary findings to the Security Committee at the end of the second day and received a reply asking me to continue. I continued. I went deeper into the personnel records, the training philosophy documents, and the incident history of human diplomatic missions over the previous 3 decades. What I found in that history was a pattern of events that had been individually logged, classified at varying levels, and never aggregated into a single analysis. I aggregated them. In 31 years of post-Cascadia diplomatic missions, human guards in formal settings had been involved in 11 documented incidents in which a threat had escalated to physical proximity of the protected party. In 11 incidents, a contact had occurred. In all 11, the protected party was uninjured. In all 11, the threat was neutralized. In 9 of the 11, the threat required medical attention. In 2 of the 11, the threat required significant medical attention. In none of the 11 had the threat died. and in none of the 11 had any human guard sustained an injury that required more than standard first aid. I want you to sit with those numbers. 11 incidents. 11 for 11. 0 deaths. 0 serious injuries to the protected party. 100% neutralization. 2 of those incidents occurred against threats that had been armed. The guards had remained unarmed throughout. I found the incident reports for those 2 armed threat events. They were brief and written in the careful, bureaucratic language that official incident reports always use. But buried in the language of each one was a detail that caught my attention. In both cases, the guard who engaged the armed threat had done so from within arm's reach. They had, in both cases, closed the distance before the threat had time to deploy their weapon effectively. They had moved faster than the decision to fire. I closed the files and sat quietly for a while, which is not something I do often. I am, as I mentioned, very good at processing large volumes of information simultaneously, but there are moments when the information exceeds what processing can usefully do with it, and you simply have to hold it. What I was holding was this. The humans had looked at the problem of diplomatic protection after Cascadia, and they had not solved it by making their guards more heavily armed. They had solved it by making their guards the kind of human beings for whom weapons were, in the most literal sense, unnecessary. They had taken the already considerable baseline of a species that had been at the top of its planet's food chain for 200 millennia, and they had built on top of it, systematically, over 4 years of intensive training, until what came out the other end was something that the galactic community did not have a clean word for. Not a soldier. A soldier is defined by their equipment. Not an officer. An officer is defined by their authority. Something older than either. Something that sits beneath the vocabulary of rank and role and training. Something that the galaxy's other species recognized, on a level beneath conscious thought, when it walked into a room. I wrote my final report. I gave it to the security committee. I included Dr. Marsh's paper. I included the incident statistics. I included the Clara Harmon interview. And at the end, I added a personal note, which archivists are not typically supposed to do, but which I felt was warranted. The note said, "The question posed to this office was why human diplomatic guards carry no weapons. The answer is that they determined, through painful experience, that weapons limited what their guards could be. They chose to remove the limit. This report recommends that the Council's Security Committee read these findings carefully and consider what it means to share a diplomatic space with beings who have made that choice." I sent the report. I went home. I made tea, which is a Muon Dai habit for settling large thoughts, and I drank it slowly, and I thought about the fact that somewhere on Nexus Station, 6 humans were standing in a room with 47 species, carrying nothing, and were almost certainly the safest people there. It took until the next morning for me to realize that what I was feeling was not entirely alarm. Some of it, much to my own surprise, was something very close to admiration. I went back to the archive the next day with a different question. Not why humans had made this choice, but what it had cost them. Clara Harmon's interview had given me the beginning of that answer, but beginnings are just the visible edge of a longer story. I went deeper. I found the commission records from the year following Cascadia, the internal debates, the disagreements, the people who argued against the new doctrine, and the people who argued for it, and the long, difficult process of arriving at a consensus that had nothing to do with what was comfortable, and everything to do with what the evidence demanded. There was a man named Dr. William Avery who had been the Commission's lead behavioral researcher, and he had kept a personal journal during the 2 years he spent developing the foundational framework of the new training program. The journal was not classified. It had been donated to the Council's public archive by his family, 15 years after his death, with a note from his daughter that said simply, he would have wanted it read. I read it. Dr. Avery was not a naturally confident man. The journal makes that clear from the first entry. He describes himself repeatedly as someone who chose research because it allowed him to operate at a comfortable remove from the things he was studying, and he describes the commission work as the first time in his professional life that he had been asked to study something with the explicit purpose of sending real people into real danger, based on what he found. He found it, he wrote, the most frightening thing I have ever agreed to do. What he found, over 2 years of research into what he calls the architecture of human threat capability, is summarized in a section of the journal from late 2274 that I will do my best to render faithfully. He writes, "We have been thinking about this wrong. We have been treating protection as a function of equipment, as if the guard is simply the thing that holds the weapon, and the weapon is where the safety actually lives. This is false. The weapon is a tool for closing a gap between the guard's innate capability and the level of threat they are expected to manage. Remove the gap and you no longer need the tool." My work for the past 18 months has been about understanding exactly how large or small that gap is in a properly trained human being, and what I have found has surprised me more than I expected. The gap is smaller than anyone is currently assuming. In fact, in environments that favor close proximity and restricted movement, which is to say, in virtually every formal diplomatic setting that exists, the gap may not exist at all. What we are actually building, in this new program, is not a protection detail. We are building the conditions under which a human being can be fully what a human being has always been, without the confusion that a weapon introduces. A weapon tells your nervous system that you have a range. Remove the weapon, and your nervous system falls back on what it has always known, that your range is everything you can reach, and your threat assessment is everything in that reach, and you are not the one who should be afraid. He ends that entry. I believe this will work. I am also aware that I will spend the rest of my career hoping I am right. He was right. The 11 incident record confirmed it. The Cascadia incident was never repeated. In 31 years of unarmed diplomatic protection, no human diplomat under guard had been seriously injured. Not one. The cost of that outcome was 4 years of the most intensive human development program I had ever encountered, repeated for every guard, for every generation, and the willingness of the humans to look at the worst thing that had happened to them and decide that the lesson was not to carry more, but to become more. I closed Dr. Avery's journal and filed it in my notes alongside everything else. The archive around me was very quiet. Archivists are used to quiet. I had spent 37 years in rooms like this one, surrounded by the accumulated record of what civilizations do, and why they do it, and what it costs them. I could not think of another example, in all that record, of a species that had responded to a catastrophic loss by choosing to trust entirely in what their people were, rather than what their people carried. Most species, faced with the Cascadia problem, would have built better weapons, would have trained better shooters, would have armored the vehicles more heavily, and added more guards and increased the firepower available at any given moment. The humans had done the opposite. They had stripped everything away and said, "This is what we are. This, alone, has to be enough." And it had been enough. Every single time. I thought about that for a long time. Then I gathered my files and walked out of the archive into the main corridor of Nexus Station, where the light was bright and the ventilation system produced a faint hum, and somewhere down the connecting passage, 47 civilizations were in a room together, negotiating the shape of the future. And 6 unarmed humans were watching over the proceedings with the quiet, absolute certainty of beings who had decided, a very long time ago, that they were enough. I found that I walked a little differently on the way back to my office. I was not sure why. I was not sure it mattered. But I walked as if the floor beneath me was something I had already decided to trust, and the corridor ahead was something I had already evaluated, and whatever was in it was something I had already accounted for. I did not know if that was admiration or something more uncomfortable than that. I still do not know. What I know is that it changed, in some small and permanent way, how I thought about what it meant to be ready for something. I made the mistake of speaking to him directly. Or rather, I made the decision. In retrospect, I am not sure those are different things. It was the 5th day of the convocation, midway through the afternoon recess, and I had been carrying the archivist's report in my data slate for 12 hours, without having found the right moment to think about it properly. The morning session had been difficult, full of the particular tension that fills a room when several large civilizations with long memories are being asked to agree on something they each privately consider a matter of national dignity. I had spent the session managing seating complaints, a translation discrepancy in the 3rd agenda item, and a moment of near crisis when the Muhari cultural liaison accidentally gestured with her left secondary appendage in a way that the Velthran delegation interpreted as a significant insult. It was not an insult. I spent 40 minutes explaining that it was not an insult. By the time the recess began, I was in the particular state of professional exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from the sustained concentration of keeping a very large number of brittle things from breaking simultaneously. I found Sergeant Nathan Cole in the corridor outside the delegate lounge, which was where I had been heading to confirm the setup for the afternoon's working group sessions. He was standing near the viewport, holding a small cup of the hot dark liquid that humans apparently require in constant supply to function. I had noticed over the preceding days that he drank it the way some beings drink water, without apparent pleasure and without apparent need to stop. He had told me its name on the second day when I had asked. Coffee. He had offered me a cup. I had declined. He had not seemed surprised. He was looking out the viewport at the stars when I arrived. He turned as I approached. In the unhurried way he did everything, and his expression shifted to the pleasant, professionally neutral look that he wore in almost every interaction. It was the look of someone who was perfectly comfortable and not about to reveal anything unless he chose to. I had been rehearsing what I wanted to ask him since reading the archivist's report the previous evening. I had planned to be indirect. I had intended to work toward the question through the surrounding material, the way a good protocol officer approaches a sensitive topic, slowly and with careful framing. Instead, I said, "Sergeant, I would like to understand why you do not carry weapons." He looked at me for a moment. Then he took a small sip of his coffee. He did not appear surprised by the question, which I noted. "Is this an official inquiry?" he asked. His tone was not guarded. It was genuinely interested, the way someone sounds when they are deciding whether to have one kind of conversation or a different one. "It is a personal one," I said. "I have read the official explanations. I would like the human one." Something shifted in his expression. "Not much." "Enough." He turned back toward the viewport for a moment, looking at the stars, and then he looked at me with an expression that was more open than any I had seen from him in 5 days. "How much do you know about wolves?" he said. I told him I did not know anything about wolves. He pulled a small personal data slate from his inner pocket and found what he was looking for in a few seconds, and held it out toward me. On the screen was a recording, footage from a natural landscape on a human world, wide open and cold-looking, covered in low vegetation and a thin layer of white frozen water. Moving through this landscape, in the middle distance, were animals. I had to look for a moment before I understood what I was looking at, because the camera was too far away, and the animals were moving with a fluid, low-to-the-ground efficiency that made it hard to track individual members of the group. There were 6 of them, large 4-legged predators, gray-furred, moving in a formation that my training immediately identified as coordinated. 2 at the front, spread wide, 2 in the middle, flanking an empty center space, 2 at the rear, slightly higher on a slope, maintaining elevation and sight lines to both sides. In front of them, running hard and beginning to tire, was something much larger than any of them individually. I watched. I did not speak. The animals did not hurry. Their pace was exactly measured, precisely enough to maintain the distance between themselves and the running animal without closing it. They were not chasing. They were, I realized, with a cold and specific clarity, herding. They were managing the direction and speed of something 3 times their individual size with the calm, unhurried precision of beings who had done this so many times that it required no urgency. The outcome was not in question. They were simply performing the steps, and the steps led where the steps always led. When the larger animal slowed, the formation shifted, 2 members moving wide to eliminate the angle that would have allowed it to turn. When it tried to break left, a single wolf was already there. Without having appeared to rush, the others maintained position. They did not seem excited. They were not frantic. They looked, more than anything else, like beings who had already finished the work and were simply present for the final moments of it. "That's a wolf pack," Sergeant Cole said, when I handed back the slate. "We had them on Earth for somewhere around 300,000 years, before we were anything like civilization. We hunted alongside them. We studied them. Some researchers think we learned from them. Some think we just developed similar strategies independently, because the same strategies work. Either way." He put the slate back in his pocket. "For most of our history, the average human being could look at that footage and understand, on a level below thought, exactly what those animals were doing, and why. Because we were doing the same thing in a different landscape. The knowledge is very old. It doesn't go away." I thought about that. "And the weapons?" I said. "A weapon is a tool," he said. It fills a gap. He looked at the viewport. A rifle tells you that you need distance. A blade tells you that you need an edge. A stunner tells you that you need a way to neutralize something that you can't neutralize without it. Every weapon describes a limitation. And you prefer not to describe your limitations, I said. We prefer not to have them, he said. Or at least, we prefer not to carry a tool that announces which ones we think we have. There's a difference between a wolf and an armed guard. The armed guard is saying, I have this specific capability, and I will deploy it under these specific circumstances. The wolf isn't saying anything. The wolf is just there. And everything in the wolf's presence knows, without being told, what that means. He sipped his coffee. He looked entirely comfortable, the way a person looks when they are describing something they have thought about for a long time, and found, after all that thought, to be simply true. The problem with that comparison, I said carefully, is that it implies that the people in that room with you understand what they are in the presence of. They don't need to understand it consciously, he said. That's rather the point. Understanding is a cognitive process. What we're talking about is something that runs underneath cognition. Every species with a threat response system has it. Something that evaluates the environment and produces a feeling before the thinking starts. That feeling doesn't require a weapon to be triggered. In fact, a weapon can actually interfere with it, because a weapon gives the threat response system something specific to evaluate, something with a known shape and a known set of countermeasures. He paused. An unarmed person who is entirely at ease in an environment gives the threat response system nothing specific, nothing to evaluate, just a general signal that says, something here is very sure of itself, and I do not know why. I stared at him. I was thinking about Drick 7 in the corridor on the first day. I did not forget their weapons. And that signal, I said slowly, produces caution. Almost always, he said. And caution is the outcome we're looking for. A cautious person is a person making a calculation. A person making a calculation is a person who has decided, at least temporarily, not to act, which gives us time. He finished his coffee and set the cup on the ledge beside him. The goal of diplomatic protection is not to stop the bad thing after it starts. The goal is to create conditions in which the bad thing never decides to start. There was a long quiet in the corridor. I was processing several things simultaneously, which I do not usually have difficulty doing, but in that moment I found I was having to work at it. The Cascadia incident, I said. Something changed in his face. Not a great deal. Enough. Yes, he said. The commission after Cascadia determined that the weapons became the problem. The commission after Cascadia determined that the weapons defined what the confrontation was, he said. When the guards returned fire, they confirmed that a battle was happening, and the people who had started the battle had planned for a battle. They had not planned for 9 people quietly refusing to be a target. He looked at the viewport. Clara Harmon survived because she lay under a vehicle and did not engage. She was the only one of the 12 who did not present a valid military target. The others, including the 8 armed guards, were all actively engaging. They were all targets. She was not a target because she gave them nothing to target. He picked up his empty cup, looked at it, set it back down. The new doctrine asks us to extend that principle deliberately. We are not targets because we present nothing to target. We carry no weapon, so there is no weapon to take, no weapon to overcome, no weapon to justify a specific level of force against. There is just us. And anyone who is thinking about what to do with us has to think about what we actually are, rather than what we are carrying, and in my experience, what we actually are tends to be the more complicated calculation. Does it bother you, I said, carrying nothing? He considered the question with what I had come to recognize as genuine seriousness, the same quality of attention he gave to everything. In the first year of training, yes, he said, because your instinct says the gun makes you safer, and the gun is not there. You have to work through that. You have to reach a place where the absence of the gun doesn't feel like a missing thing, where it feels like an accurate thing. He looked at me. Once you get there, it doesn't bother you. It's just the truth. The gun was never what kept anyone safe. The gun was just the most recent answer to the question of how to manage an environment you didn't fully trust yet. When you fully trust your ability to read an environment and respond to what you find, the gun becomes redundant. I walked back to my office afterward and sat for a very long time without doing anything. My data slate sat on my desk with the archivist's report on the screen, the sentence from Dr. Avery's journal visible at the bottom of the page. Your range is everything you can reach, and your threat assessment is everything in that reach, and you are not the one who should be afraid. I had read that sentence 12 times the previous evening and found it theoretical. Now I found it differently. Now I found it the most precise thing I had read in 5 days, because I had just spent 20 minutes in a corridor with the person that sentence was describing, and the person it was describing was entirely ordinary to look at, perfectly pleasant to speak with, and the most comprehensively unafraid individual I had encountered in 22 years of professional life. Not because nothing scared him. I did not believe for a moment that nothing scared him, because he had already decided what he would do about everything in that room, and that decision had been made so long ago and rehearsed so thoroughly that it no longer required his attention. He could simply be present. He could hold a cup of coffee and look at the stars and talk about wolves with the ease of a person who has finished all the important work in advance and is now simply waiting, without urgency, for whatever comes next. I thought about what he had said about Clara Harmon lying under the vehicle. Not engaging, presenting nothing to target. I thought about 6 people walking through the gate of Nexus Station with empty hands, presenting nothing to target, and how that emptiness was, now that I understood it, the most complete statement of confidence I had ever seen walk through a door. I messaged Drix7 and told him to come to my office when he had a moment. When he arrived, I showed him the wolf footage from my own data slate, which I had found and saved after the conversation ended. He watched it. He frowned. He watched it again. "That's what they are?" he said. "That's what they have always been," I said. "The question is whether we were going to notice before something gave us a reason to." He looked at the screen for another moment. Then he looked at me. "You think something is going to give us a reason," he said. It was not quite a question. I thought about Harkon in the corridor. I thought about the security chief's report, which I had also been copied on, which described behavioral compression in the human guards on the morning of the 4th day. I thought about the audio fragment from the corridor outside the meeting room that the security chief had mentioned in her follow-up note. "I think," I said carefully, "that someone on this station is about to make a very expensive mistake." Drix7 put down the data slate. He looked at me the way he had looked at me in the entry corridor on the first day, when I had told him the humans had not forgotten their weapons. "What do we do?" he said. "Our job," I said, "and hope we are faster than the mistake." We were not faster. We were almost exactly the same speed, which in the end was close enough, but only barely. What I remember most about the next 2 hours is the quality of the quiet that settled over the afternoon as the working groups moved to their secondary rooms, the kind of quiet that comes not from the absence of noise but from the presence of something large holding its breath. I had been in enough tense diplomatic situations to recognize that quality, but I had always associated it with the diplomats, with the civilizations they represented, with the weight of the decisions being made. This time the quiet was coming from somewhere else. It was coming from the 6 people posted around the edges of the room, and specifically from the slight continuous adjustment in their positioning that I kept noticing from the corner of my eye. Not large adjustments, nothing that a delegate would see, small ones, a weight shift, a stance that opened a line of sight slightly wider. The forward guard, a man named Corporal Owen Briggs, who had been positioned at the right side door since the session began, had moved by mid-afternoon to a position 3 paces to the left of where he started. The move had happened over the course of 90 minutes, one small adjustment at a time. He had not drawn attention to it, but from his new position, anyone entering through the left corridor junction would encounter him before they reached the undersecretary's table. Someone had told him, without words, to be there, or he had figured it out on his own, which was in some ways more unsettling. Petra Graves, the cultural liaison they were protecting, was seated 2 places down from the undersecretary, taking notes on the afternoon's session. She was young and earnest, and spoke 7 languages, and was, by every professional measure, excellent at her job. She was also, as I had learned from the audio fragment, and from 3 hours of subsequent corridor observation, the specific person that someone on the station had been discussing in terms that the security chief's translation algorithms had flagged as concerning. I had not been able to get the rest of the audio, The fragment I had seen referenced a plan and a location, Corridor 7. That was what we had. That and the uncomfortable knowledge that the human guards had somehow known about it before the audio system had flagged it. I watched Owen Briggs settle into his new position and look exactly like someone who had always been standing there. I watched Nathan Cole, at the rear of the room, complete another of his quiet environmental scans. His eyes moved across the room, registered my position and my expression, stayed for a half second, and moved on. He had seen that I was tense. I was certain of it. He had catalogued it and moved on, because a tense protocol attaché was low on his priority list at that moment, and whatever was on the top of that list was somewhere outside the room, and he was already aware of it, and he was already ready. I excused myself from the working group session and went to find Drix 7, and told him to pull the Corridor 7 footage from the last 4 hours. And then I stood in the monitoring room and waited, and the afternoon pressed forward, and the station held its breath, and somewhere down the corridor, Petra Graves gathered her notes, and the session wrapped, and the delegation prepared to return to their quarters. I had my comm open to the security chief's channel before they reached the junction. The footage from Corridor 7 exists. I have watched it more times than I can count. I have shown it to my senior analyst, to the Council's Security Committee, and to 3 independent behavioral researchers who specialize in close proximity threat response. All of them have described watching it as, in various terms and phrasing, one of the more disquieting experiences of their professional careers. I include myself in that assessment, without reservation. But I am getting ahead of the sequence of events, and the sequence matters. Let me go back to the part that preceded the footage, because what happened before the corridor tells you why what happened in the corridor happened the way it did. And if you do not understand the why, the footage is simply astonishing. With the why, it is something more than that. It is clarifying. I had been in contact with the protocol attaché's office and with my own response team for the preceding hour. My response team was positioned in the connecting passage near Junction 4, close enough to Corridor 7 to reach it in 40 seconds. I considered that sufficient. I am still not entirely sure whether to be embarrassed about that estimate or simply to note it as evidence that I was operating without the relevant context. Petra Graves left the working group session at 1712 station time in the company of Undersecretary Cole, the 2 senior advisors, the language specialist, and the technical aide. The 6 guards moved into their escort configuration without visible communication, taking their now familiar positions around the delegation. Sergeant Cole at left rear, Corporal Briggs at right forward. The other 4 spread in the pattern I had by now memorized. Coverage at every angle, no overlap, no gap. I was watching on the feed from my monitoring room and feeding the live view to my response team's earpieces simultaneously, doing the kind of active coordination that 11 years of incident management trains you for. I had also sent a message to the Corridor 7 environmental sensor cluster, asking for a live audio feed, which was processing. At 1718, the delegation turned into the junction leading to Corridor 7. At 1719 and roughly 40 seconds, the audio feed from Corridor 7 began returning sound. What I heard, over the feed, was the particular acoustic quality of a corridor, in which several large beings were moving deliberately toward a smaller group from a perpendicular direction. I have worked in security long enough to know that sound. It is the sound of a funnel being set, something waiting at an angle, using a junction to limit the available response space. At 1720, the Corridor 7 video feed showed 4 Dravathi security personnel emerging from the side passage that connects to Corridor 7 at its midpoint. They were off-duty Dravathi guards attached to the hegemony's delegation, which meant they had full station access on their personal credentials, but no official function in this area at this time. They were large beings in a narrow space, and they moved into the corridor in a way that was designed to fill it. The lead individual was Harkin, the same Harkin I had seen in the biometric feeds 3 days earlier, the one whose cortisol had spiked when he passed Nathan Cole in a junction and looked away first. He was moving with a deliberateness that told me everything I needed to know about whether this was a coincidence. They positioned themselves between the delegation and the far end of the corridor, not blocking the path entirely, but occupying enough of the available space to make any movement past them require active negotiation. I was already on the comm to my response team. I told them to move. I told them they had approximately 40 seconds. I told them that number with confidence, because 40 seconds was the corridor length plus the transit time from Junction 4, and I had run those calculations when I set up the coverage. At 1721, I stopped believing in my 40 seconds. What happened in that corridor over the next 9 seconds is the thing I have now watched 47 times. I will try to describe it as accurately as I can, which I acknowledge is imperfectly, because some of what happened occupies a space in my understanding that my professional vocabulary does not fully reach. Harkon spoke first. "I have the audio," he said, in Dravathi, that the junior diplomatic personnel would need to come with him for a verification consultation that had been arranged by the hegemony's senior attaché. This was false. I knew it was false because there was no such consultation on any schedule I had access to, and because the hegemony's senior attaché was, at that moment, in the secondary meeting room on the opposite side of the station, attending a separate working group session that I had confirmed was still in progress. It was a pretext, a clumsy one, the kind of pretext that does not need to be convincing because the person delivering it is positioned in a way that suggests the other party does not have many options. I watched Nathan Cole hear the pretext. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say I watched him hear it, because it was not a passive event. I could see, on the feed, the moment the words registered, not because his expression changed dramatically. It changed very slightly, in a way that someone who had been watching his face for 5 days could read, and someone who had not been watching it could not. A small, specific settling. The way a person looks when they have been expecting something, and it has arrived exactly on schedule. The words were not a surprise. He had already decided what they meant before Harkon finished speaking them. What happened next took 9 seconds from the point at which Cole moved to the point at which all 4 Dravathi were on the floor of the corridor. I am not going to try to describe it in the kind of detail that the footage provides, because I do not have language for most of it that would be accurate rather than melodramatic. What I can tell you is the structural outline. Cole did not move first. Corporal Owen Briggs moved first, from his forward right position, and his movement served 2 functions simultaneously. It placed him between Harkon's 3 subordinates and the delegation, and it drew their attention, which is a different thing from drawing their focus. And the difference matters enormously in those first fractions of a second, when a threat is making its decision about what to prioritize. Cole moved second, but the interval between Briggs and Cole was so small that on first viewing of the footage I could not separate them. What I can tell you is that Cole moved toward Harkon rather than away from him, which was the opposite of every threat response instinct I have ever trained into my own officers, and that the distance between them closed so rapidly that Harkon's attempt to adjust his position was already too late before it had fully begun. The other 4 guards from the delegation had, in the same window of time, reorganized in a way that placed the non-guard delegation members against the wall of the corridor at their left, behind the coverage line, and created a barrier between them and the ongoing situation that was composed entirely of human bodies and did not contain a single weapon of any kind. What happened after that happened in a space that the corridor camera's angle did not fully capture, which I have since noted as a gap I need to address in my sensor coverage planning. What the camera did capture was the perimeter of it. The 3 Dravathi subordinates who attempted to move past Owen Briggs, and did not succeed, and the positions they occupied when they stopped not succeeding. They were not dead. I want to be clear about that. In my initial 6 seconds of watching the footage I was not entirely sure, because the way they were positioned on the corridor floor looked like beings who had reached the absolute limit of what their bodies were willing to continue doing, and that look can be alarming. But all 4 were breathing. All 4 were intact. All 4 were, by the time my response team arrived at 1722, demonstrating the quiet, dazed quality of beings who have encountered something that their nervous systems are still attempting to classify. Harkon was sitting against the right wall of the corridor. He was sitting in the particular way of someone whose legs have declined to continue being useful for the moment, which I recognized from previous incident reports as a physiological response common to Dravathi when they experience a rapid and unexpected loss of structural advantage. His face was expressing something that I have reviewed the footage many times trying to name, and the best I can say is that it was the expression of a person who has made a significant assumption about the shape of the world and discovered that the shape is different from what they assumed. Nathan Cole was standing 2 paces in front of him. Cole's posture was the same posture he had maintained in every room on this station for the past 5 days. Upright, easy, calm. His hands were at his sides. His breathing, per the biometric feed, was elevated slightly from his resting baseline. Not significantly. About what you would expect from a brief walk at a slightly elevated pace. He was looking at Harkon with the expression I had first seen in the entry corridor 5 days ago. Calm, present, and completely revealing of nothing. When my response team arrived, Cole turned and looked at their lead officer and said, "You might want to send a medic to Corridor 7. Nothing that won't recover, but they'll want to be seen." Then he turned back to the delegation, checked that Petra Graves was uninjured, which she was, and resumed his position at left rear of the escort formation, as if the intervening 9 seconds had been a brief administrative pause. Graves was standing against the wall with the other non-guard delegation members. She was white in the face and absolutely steady in the eyes, and she said nothing for approximately 4 seconds, and then she said, to Cole, "Thank you, Sergeant." Her voice was level. "Of course," he said, and meant it, in the simple, direct way of someone for whom the phrase describes an obligation already met. My response team secured Harkon and his 3 subordinates and began the process of getting them medical support and beginning the incident report that was going to be, I already knew, one of the most significant documents produced during this convocation. I managed the initial scene remotely and sent Drix 7 to the corridor physically, and then I sat in my monitoring room and rewatched the 9-second footage sequence 11 times in immediate succession before I made myself stop. Here is what I noted. Across those 11 viewings, the Dravathi subordinates had been, by any objective standard, formidable individuals. They were trained hegemony security personnel, physically powerful, experienced, and in an environment they believed they had advantage in. They had positional advantage. They had numerical advantage. The 4 humans directly engaging them had none of those advantages, by traditional calculation. The engagement lasted 9 seconds. In those 9 seconds, not one human guard sustained an observable injury of any kind. I confirmed this with the medical team who examined all 6 guards afterward, because the incident report required it. The medical team, who were experienced Theran physicians familiar with multiple species' physiological profiles, reported that all 6 human guards were in the same physical condition after the incident as they had been before it. No bruising, no soft tissue damage, no elevated inflammatory response. The 4 Dravathi required medical assessment for an average of 2 hours each. I am not going to speculate extensively about the technique involved, because the full training methodology is restricted, and because I do not have the specialist background to describe it accurately. What I can say, based on what I observed, is that the engagement appeared to be organized around a principle I can only describe as removing the other party's ability to continue, as efficiently, and with as little additional consequence as possible. There was nothing gratuitous about it, nothing excessive. It appeared, in those 9 seconds, to be the application of exactly the amount of effort required to reach the outcome, and nothing beyond that. That precision, I realized later, was perhaps the most disturbing part. Not because it implied cruelty, because it implied the complete opposite, such thorough understanding of the variables involved that the result could be calibrated exactly, without overshoot, without waste, without the kind of escalation that happens when a party is operating from urgency rather than certainty. Urgency is what you feel when you are not sure how things will go. These people were not urgent. They had been the least urgent beings on this station from the moment they walked through the gate. I wrote my incident report. It ran to 47 pages, because I am thorough, and because I believed the security committee needed to understand every element of what had occurred in that corridor. I included the biometric data. I included the positioning analysis. I included the 9-second footage with a frame-by-frame annotation. And at the end, I included a recommendation. The recommendation was not what the committee expected. It was not about increased security protocols, or surveillance adjustments, or a review of the Dravathi delegation's station access. All of those were necessary and I addressed them, but the final recommendation was different. It said, the Council should formally request that the Human Confederacy provide a briefing on its diplomatic guard selection and training methodology, with the specific aim of developing a cross-cultural understanding of the principles involved. Not for replication, as the methodology appears to be deeply embedded in human-specific developmental pathways, but for understanding, because we are sharing diplomatic spaces with human protection personnel on an ongoing basis, and we do not currently have an accurate framework for what that means. This incident demonstrated that our existing frameworks are insufficient. It demonstrated this in the most direct way possible. We should be grateful that the demonstration was conducted on our behalf. The committee acknowledged the report. They did not respond to the final recommendation for 11 days, which in committee terms is relatively prompt. When they did respond, the message was brief. It said that the recommendation had been noted and that a formal request had been submitted to the Human Confederacy's diplomatic office. The response from the Human Confederacy arrived within 6 hours, which, for an interstellar diplomatic communication, is almost instantaneous, as if they had been expecting the question, as if they had already, long before anyone on Nexus Station had thought to ask it, decided what the answer would be. That, I thought, reading the response, was the most human thing of all. The Human Confederacy's response was courteous, precise, and contained one sentence that I have since quoted in every briefing I have given on the subject, because it is the clearest expression of the philosophy I have encountered outside of Dr. Avery's journal. The sentence was, "We appreciate the Council's interest and are happy to discuss the principles of our diplomatic guard program, with the understanding that what we are describing is not a technique, but a commitment to the proposition that the most reliable protection comes from being, rather than having, and that our guards are selected and developed on that basis. Being, rather than having." I sat with that sentence for a long time. I had spent 11 years in security, thinking entirely in terms of having enough personnel, having the right equipment, having adequate response times, having correctly calibrated sensor coverage. Having was the entire grammar of security, as I had practiced it. Being was a different language entirely, and I was not sure I had ever been taught it. I thought about Corporal Lucy Grant, who had not reacted to the falling water vessel in the second-day session, not because she had not heard it, but because her assessment system had already processed the sound and determined its category and moved past it before the physical reaction could occur. That was not a technique. That was not something she was doing with a tool. That was something she was. It was the product of 4 years of systematic development of a capacity that had been present in her from the beginning, the same capacity that was present in every human being from birth, the inheritance of 200,000 years of being a predator on a planet that did not offer mercy to the unprepared. They had not built a better weapon. They had built a better self. I thought about Nathan Cole standing in front of Harkon in that corridor, with his hands at his sides, and Harkon sitting against the wall trying to remember how the world worked, and Cole's biometrics reading the same steady, unremarkable calm they had read in the entry corridor on day 1. No spike, no crash, no evidence in the physiology of anything that would require recovery. He had done something significant in that corridor, by any measure, and his body had treated it as a minor event, because for a person who had been preparing for exactly that kind of moment for 4 years, under conditions designed to make it familiar rather than exceptional, it was a minor event. It was a decision made, executed, and filed, nothing more. I thought about the wolf pack in the footage, the 2 at the rear maintaining elevation and sight lines, the 2 in the middle holding the center, the 2 at the front, spreading wide, moving without urgency toward an outcome that had already been decided, not because the outcome was certain by any objective measure, because they had decided it was, and that decision was the most important variable in the situation. I am the one who gets to decide. That was Dr. Marsh's line, from the paper archivist Pell had found and filed in the report. I had initially read it as arrogance. I now read it as something quite different. It was not arrogance. It was the statement of a being that has fully inhabited its own capability, that has looked at what it is, without flinching, and decided that what it is enough. There is a quality to that kind of confidence that is unlike any other kind I have encountered. Other species produce confidence through equipment, through rank, through numbers, through demonstrated capability in known domains. That confidence is real, and it functions, but it has a boundary, a point at which the equipment might fail, or the rank might not be recognized, or the numbers might be insufficient, and that boundary is present in the confidence itself. You can feel it if you know what to look for. The 6 humans on this station did not produce confidence with a boundary. They produced the kind of confidence that does not have a boundary, because it does not derive from anything external that could be removed. It derived from something they had made part of themselves, over 4 years of work, and what they had made part of themselves was a complete and settled answer to the question of what they were, and what that meant in any situation they were likely to encounter. Harkon had looked at Nathan Cole in that junction 3 days before the corridor incident, and his body had registered something it could not name. His cortisol had spiked briefly, involuntarily, and resolved as he moved away. He had then, over the following 3 days, done what threatened beings who do not fully understand the threat often do. He had convinced himself that the feeling was wrong. He had reasoned around it. He had focused on what he could see, which was 6 unarmed individuals in plain uniforms, and had decided that the feeling his body had produced was an error. It was not an error. His body had been entirely correct. He had simply chosen not to listen to it. That mistake, in Corridor 7, had cost him 2 hours of medical attention and whatever remained of his posting on Nexus Station, because I recommended in my incident report that the Dravathi security personnel involved be removed from the station within 24 hours, and the Council's Security Committee agreed before I had finished the sentence. Harkonnen was transported off station on the morning following the incident. He did not speak publicly about what had happened in the corridor. The official record reflected that a Dravathi guard had attempted an unauthorized detention of a Council diplomatic staff member and had been removed per standard incident protocol. What was not in the official record, but was in my personal notes, was that Harkon had looked, during the processing of his removal, at Nathan Cole, who was standing across the corridor during the transfer. He had looked for approximately 3 seconds, and then he had looked at the floor and not looked back up. He understood now. He had had the night to understand it, and he understood. He had looked at Cole in that junction and felt something his body could not name, and he had been right, and he had talked himself out of being right, and the corridor was the result. Cole, for his part, had watched the transfer with the same expression he wore for everything, and then he had turned back to the delegate lounge entrance and resumed his position, and the convocation had continued, and the galaxy had kept turning, and nobody had said anything that needed to be said, because nothing needed to be said. The situation had spoken for itself, clearly and precisely, and without a single word. In 40 years of sitting in this chair, I have had perhaps 11 truly important conversations. I counted them once, during a period of enforced rest following a minor health incident, when I had time to review what my career had actually consisted of, as opposed to what it looked like from the outside. 40 years of sessions and hearings and formal proceedings and diplomatic functions and ceremonial events, and when I reduced it to the conversations that had genuinely changed the shape of something, 11 was the number I arrived at. The conversation with Undersecretary Marin Cole was the 12th. I am High Arbiter Sunvel of the Galactic Council. I am Athene, which means I am very old by most species' reckoning, and moderately old by my own. And I have spent enough time in this work to have developed a fairly precise instrument for detecting when a conversation is one of the 11, and when it merely appears to be. The instrument is imperfect, but it is calibrated by experience, and it told me, when Undersecretary Cole walked into my private office on the morning of the 8th day, and sat down across from me without requiring me to tell her where to sit, that I was about to have a conversation that would alter something. She came alone. That was the first thing I noted. Her guards were in the outer corridor. She had not required them to accompany her into my office, and she had not asked whether she needed to, and she had not made any visible acknowledgement of leaving them behind. She had simply come in, and they had remained where they were, and the arrangement had an ease that suggested it was not negotiated but understood. They knew where she was. She knew they knew. That was sufficient. She looked at me with the particular quality of attention that I had come to associate with humans in formal settings, which is total and somewhat disconcerting if you are not prepared for it. Not aggressive, not performative, simply full. They look at you the way you would look at something you intended to understand completely. I had asked her to come because of the incident report from Corridor 7, and because of the security chief's broader report, and because of the archivist's findings, and because I had been a high arbiter long enough to know that when 3 independent assessments of a situation produce the same underlying conclusion, someone should have a conversation about that conclusion with the people at the center of it. I told her what we had found, the biometric profiles, the behavioral analysis, the Cascadia documentation, and the commission records and Dr. Avery's journal, the incident in Corridor 7, and what the footage showed, and what the medical reports of the 4 Dravathi confirmed. I laid it all out, methodically, the way I lay out evidence in any formal proceeding, letting the weight of the accumulation do the work. She listened without interrupting. She had the quality that the best diplomats have, which is the capacity to listen to something fully before deciding what to do with it, rather than building their response while the other party is still speaking. When I finished, she did not respond immediately. She was quiet for a moment, her hands folded on the table, looking at a point in the middle distance that I have learned, in 40 years of meetings, is where people look when they are having a real thought rather than a performed one. "Hi, Arbiter," she said. "I want to ask you something before I answer any of this. When your delegates see our guards walk into a room, what is the first thing they notice?" I considered this. "That they carry nothing," I said. She nodded. "And what does that communicate?" "Informally?" I said. "Please." "Informally," I said. "The initial assessment is that they are either unprepared or unconcerned. The two possibilities the mind reaches for when something expected is absent." "And those are very different assessments," she said. "Yes." "Which one do people eventually land on?" she asked, "after they have been in the room with them for a while?" I thought about the 11 sessions I had observed since the delegation arrived. I thought about Kreeth of the Sarathi, who had ended a statement early on the first evening without ever explaining why. I thought about the 3 Muhari delegates who had reviewed the Corridor 7 incident report, and subsequently requested that their own seating assignment be moved closer to the human delegation's table, without providing a reason. I thought about the small, consistent drift that the station's behavioral monitoring had documented over the course of the week, in which delegates from several civilizations had begun, without appearing to consciously choose to do so, orienting slightly toward the human section of the room. "Unconcerned," I said. "Eventually." "Yes," she said. "And that is the most important word in the entire doctrine, High Arbiter. Not capable, not trained, unconcerned, because capability can be overcome, if the other party has enough resources and enough resolve, but unconcern is something different. Unconcern says, I have already assessed this situation, and my assessment is that whatever happens here is within what I can manage, and I am not worried about it." She unfolded her hands and set them flat on the table. "We spent a long time after Cascadia thinking about what protection actually means. Not what it looks like, what it is. And what we kept arriving at was that the most reliable form of protection is not a layer you add on the outside of a person, a weapon, or an armor, or a guard detail. The most reliable form is what the person produces from the inside, the way they hold themselves, the way they read a room, the way the room reads them." She paused. "A weapon says to the environment, I am aware that danger exists, and I have provided for it. And that sentence, however practical it sounds, contains 2 concessions. It concedes that danger might be beyond your management without the weapon, and it concedes that the weapon might fail. Our guards make neither concession. They might still fail," I said carefully. "Even without a weapon in hand, they are not invincible." "Of course not," she said, "without any defensiveness. No protection is absolute. Ours is not either. But the question is not whether any given protection is perfect. The question is what it communicates, and to whom, and at what level of the other party's awareness. An armed guard communicates to the conscious mind of the threat. It says, there is a consequence to your action. The conscious mind can evaluate consequences. It can weigh them. It can decide, if the stakes are high enough, that the consequence is acceptable." She looked at me steadily. "Our guards do not communicate to the conscious mind of the threat. They communicate to the part that runs below conscious thought, the part that evaluates environment before the mind has had time to form a question. And what they communicate to that part is, something here is not what you have assumed. Something here has already decided how this goes, and that part of the threat's mind does not have a counter to that information. It does not have a calculation that resolves the uncertainty. It only has the uncertainty, and the uncertainty is very uncomfortable. And the most common response to very uncomfortable uncertainty is to do nothing while you attempt to figure out what you are dealing with. And while they are figuring it out," I said slowly, "your people have time." "Our people have time," she agreed. "Time is what you need. In a formal diplomatic setting, 90% of threats resolve if you have enough time. People reconsider. The moment passes. The situation shifts. If you can produce 30 seconds of reconsideration in a person who is building toward action, the action frequently does not occur. Our guards, in most situations, produce more than 30 seconds. I was thinking about something, and I decided to say it directly, because I have found in 40 years that direct is usually the most efficient path through an important conversation. In Corridor 7, I said, there was not 30 seconds of reconsideration. No, she said, there was not. There was a different decision. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. When reconsideration is not available, we move to the second option, which is... She looked at me with the expression I had seen on Sergeant Cole's face every day for 8 days, calm, present, and entirely at ease with what she was about to say. Resolution, she said, as efficiently as possible, without more than what the situation requires. I sat with that. 4 Dravathi military-grade security personnel, I said, were managed, she said, without lasting harm to anyone involved, including them, in 9 seconds. In approximately 9 seconds, yes. I looked at her for a moment. I am not a person who is easily silenced. 40 years in this chair have given me a vocabulary for almost every situation I encounter. I found, in that moment, that I was temporarily without a useful next sentence. High Arbiter, she said, and her tone was not unkind. I do not think you called me here to receive a security briefing. I think you called me here because you have been watching our people for 8 days, and you want to understand something that the briefings are not fully explaining. Yes, I said, that is correct. What is the question? She said. I took a moment to form it correctly, because the question had been somewhere underneath everything I had read and heard for the past several days, and I had not yet found the precise words for it. I found them now. Why, I said, does the rest of the galaxy not produce this? She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then she said, every species produces it, in individuals. There are people in every civilization who have the baseline and the inclination and the discipline to develop what our guards develop. The difference is not species. The difference is systematic cultivation. We decided, after Cascadia, to build a program around cultivating it deliberately. Most civilizations have not made that decision, because most civilizations are still trying to solve the protection problem by adding things rather than developing people. Adding weapons, I said. Adding anything, she said. Better equipment, better technology, better communications, better response times. All useful. None of them address the fundamental question of what the person at the center of the situation actually is. And what does your program believe the person should be? She considered. Settled, she said finally. That is the word we use internally. A settled person has assessed their environment and made peace with what they found in it. They are not afraid, because they have already answered the questions that fear uses to operate. What is in this room? What could it do? What would I do if it did? A settled person has worked through those questions in advance, not in the moment, and arrived at conclusions they trust. And when you are settled, the room cannot unsettle you, because the room is not producing new information. It is producing variations on information you have already processed. And you can train someone to be settled, I said. You can train someone to do the work that produces settlement, she said. The settlement itself is what remains when the work is done. 4 years of work, in our program. 4 years of training the person to have already finished thinking about every situation they are likely to encounter, so that when the situation arrives, they are simply implementing a decision they have already made. I thought about Nathan Cole in Corridor 7, the 9-second footage, the biometric flatline before and after, a decision made in advance, implemented when the situation arrived, filed when it was done. It sounds very cold, I said, reduced to those terms. It is the opposite of cold, she said, and for the first time in the conversation, there was something in her voice that went beyond the careful professional calm she had maintained throughout. Something that I recognized, in my 40 years of reading rooms, as genuine feeling. Every guard who goes through that program does it because they have decided that the people they protect matter, not abstractly, not as a category, specifically. Nathan Cole has worked with Petra Graves for 3 months. He knows her coffee preference and her primary research interest, and the name of her youngest sibling. He knows those things because knowing them is part of what makes him settled in her vicinity. She is not a protectee. She is a person. The settlement is specific to her. That is not cold. That is the opposite. The room was very quiet. I thought about something the archivist had found in Dr. Avery's journal. Your range is everything you can reach, and everyone in your reach is someone you have already decided to protect. The convocation ends in 4 days, I said. Yes. Your delegation will return home. Yes. And we will return to the question of what to do with what we have learned here. She looked at me with the calm, full attention that I had stopped finding disconcerting sometime around the 3rd day, and had started finding simply honest. I hope you find a useful answer, she said. I think you will. You are very good at this. She stood, gathered her materials with the efficient ease of a person who does not waste motion, and walked to the door. She paused. High Arbiter, she said. For what it's worth, the Council has always been good at this, at gathering many very different things in one room, and finding a way for them to coexist. That is not a small skill. It is in fact the hardest skill there is. I think you have been undervaluing it. She left. The door closed. I sat in my office for several minutes longer than the schedule allowed, looking at the space she had occupied, thinking about what she had said. Settled, she had called it, the state that remains when the work is done. I thought about 40 years of sessions and proceedings and negotiations, and the 11 conversations that had changed the shape of something. I thought about the work those 11 conversations had required, and the decisions they had produced, and the things those decisions had become. I thought about what it would mean to have already done the work, to arrive at every situation having already answered the questions it would ask, to be, in every room, simply the implementation of a decision already made. I thought that it sounded, when you put it that way, very much like what the Atheni call wisdom. We had always assumed that wisdom was what happened when you were old enough, when you had seen enough, when time had given you enough data to produce settled conclusions. The humans had decided that wisdom was something you could cultivate deliberately, with the right program and the right commitment, in 4 years. I was not sure whether that was humbling or inspiring. I decided, after a moment, that it was both, and that there was nothing wrong with it being both. I opened the schedule for the afternoon session, and prepared my materials, and did not think about any of it for the next 4 hours, because I had work to do, and the work was important. But that evening, alone in my office, I wrote a note to myself that I have kept since that day, in the small personal archive where I keep things I do not want to forget. The note says, ask what the person actually is, before asking what they are carrying. I have read it many times since then. It has been useful more often than I expected. There was one more thing from that conversation that I did not include in the note, because it did not fit in the kind of language I use for notes. It was something Undersecretary Cole had said early in the meeting, almost in passing, that I had moved past at the time, and returned to only later, sitting alone in the evening, with the station's mechanical hum around me, and the stars very steady in the viewport glass. She had said, in the middle of explaining the doctrine, we needed the guards to be something that couldn't be taken from them. I had understood it, at the time, as a practical observation about the vulnerability of equipment. A weapon can be lost. A weapon can be taken. A weapon can fail at a critical moment. Training, the reasoning goes, cannot be removed. But sitting with it later, I understood that she had meant something larger. Not just that the training could not be physically removed, that the thing the training produced could not be invalidated by any external circumstance. A being who has truly internalized the capacity she described is not capable, in any given moment, of being made uncapable. The situation cannot present a variable that has not been pre-processed. The threat cannot produce an environment that has not already been assessed and answered. The person, to use the word she had used, is settled. And settled means already done with the part where you decide whether you can handle this. A weapon can be taken. What Nathan Cole carried into that corridor could not be taken. It was not a tool. It was not an addition. It was the architecture of what he was, built over 4 years, and every moment before and after them. And it went everywhere he went, and it was not possible to remove it, and it was not possible to match it with something that had a different shape, because its shape was not a weapon's shape. Its shape was a person, a specific, settled, already decided person, who had looked at every version of what a corridor on a diplomatic station might contain, and had decided, in advance, what he would do in each case, and had then walked into the corridor and implemented the relevant decision with the calm efficiency of someone completing a task they had already thought through. That is what the galaxy had not understood about the humans. We had been measuring them in the vocabulary of capability. What weapons did they have? What ships could they deploy? What technology could they bring to bear? We had never asked what kind of being walks off those ships. We had never measured the thing that the weapons were, in a sense, preventing us from seeing, because a species with weapons looks, from the outside, like a species that depends on them, and a species that depends on its weapons is a species that can be assessed by the quality of those weapons. The humans had removed the weapons and shown us what was underneath. And what was underneath was something that had been there the entire time, something that had predated the weapons by 200,000 years, something that no technological development had actually changed, only supplemented, and that came forward now, quiet and complete and settled, in 6 plain uniforms with empty hands. I am 40 years in this chair. I have tried to be honest in my work. I am being honest now when I say that what I felt, sitting alone with that thought on the evening of the 8th day, was not fear, not awe, not the complicated professional emotion of a diplomat trying to categorize a strategic situation. What I felt, simply and completely, was respect. The clean, uncomplicated kind that you cannot strategize around, and cannot perform, and cannot decide to feel. The kind that just arrives, when you have been given enough information to understand what something actually is, and your understanding catches up with the reality. I finished my evening tea and went to prepare for the following day's session, and I carried the respect with me, and I still carry it now, and I do not think that will change. The convocation ended on a Tuesday, by the station calendar. I know that because I filed the closing logistics report at 1700 exactly, which is the standard closing time, and the date and time are in the header, and I have pulled that report from my archive several times in the month since, not to read the logistics but to confirm the date. I needed, for a while, to remind myself that the events of those 12 days were real and documented, and not something my memory had assembled in retrospect. They were real. The reports are very clear, and I know they were real because I was there for the last of it, standing in the departure bay on the station's lower level, doing the thing that protocol officers do at the end of every event, which is to manage the orderly exit of 47 delegations and their personnel and luggage and equipment and, in the case of 3 delegations, livestock requirements, while maintaining the procedural records that prove the event happened in accordance with the governing diplomatic frameworks. It is, in other words, the most administrative and least glamorous part of the entire operation, and I have presided over it 41 times, and it is always slightly chaotic, and it is always slightly relieving when it ends. And it had never, in any of those 41 instances, produced a moment that I was still thinking about months later. The human delegation departed last. This was partly logistics. Their shuttle connection required a longer docking window than the others, but it was also, I think, simply characteristic. They were the last to arrive, in the sense that they were the species who had taken longest to accept the Council's invitation, and they were the last to leave. And both of those things were consistent with a group of people who do things on their own timeline and have decided, somewhere deep in their collective character, not to hurry for anyone else's convenience. The 6 guards moved through the departure bay in their usual configuration, unhurried, perfectly positioned, each one occupying exactly the angle they needed to occupy. I had become, over 12 days, so familiar with their formation that I could tell when it was correct without thinking about it. The same way you learn the proper feel of a door latch and notice when it is not quite right. They were always correct. The undersecretary was completing her final courtesy round, the brief exchange of formal farewells with council staff that is protocol at the end of a convocation. She was doing it with the same pleasant efficiency she brought to everything, working her way through the line of staff members with a handshake and the appropriate closing phrase in each one's language, which she delivered without pausing to think and without consulting notes. I was third from the end of the line. When she reached me, she took my hand and said, in correct formal Theran, with an accent that was not perfect, but was better than I expected from someone for whom it was a third language, "This was a genuine pleasure. Your work was exceptional." I thanked her. I meant it, which I do not always. She moved on. Sergeant Nathan Cole was the last through the departure bay's formal area, because he was the last through everything, checking it before he left it. I watched him do his final scan of the bay, the dock connection points, the crew area entrance, the bay staff positions, the loading equipment, the other delegations who were still finalizing their own departures in adjacent bays visible through the transparent partition. The scan took approximately 5 seconds. Then he picked up the small carry case he had left near the exit while he conducted the check and prepared to follow his delegation onto the shuttle. I do not know why I spoke to him. I had not planned to. I had planned to complete the departure processing and file the closing report and go to bed early, because 12 days of the most significant diplomatic event I had ever managed had left me with the kind of tiredness that lives below the surface of everything and can only be resolved by a long sleep. Instead, I said his name. He turned, unhurried. He looked at me with the full, calm, unreadable attention that I had by now entirely stopped finding disconcerting, and had simply come to accept as what he looked like when he was present, which was always. "Sergeant," I said, "I have one more question." He set down his carry case. "Of course," he said. I had been thinking about how to phrase this for 2 days. I had tried several versions. All of them came out slightly wrong, slightly too diplomatic, too hedged, too much of the professional vocabulary that I have spent 22 years developing, and that is, I have found, occasionally an obstacle to saying the actual thing. So I said the actual thing. "Were you ever afraid, in any of it, any of the 12 days?" He looked at me for a moment. The bay around us was loud with departure activity, equipment moving, staff communication, the mechanical sounds of shuttle connections and cargo transfers. He was very still in all of it, in the way he was always still, and he considered the question with what I had come to understand was his genuine mode of thinking, which was not a performance of consideration, but actual consideration. "Of course," he said, "a couple of times." I had not expected that answer. I had prepared myself for one of two things: a denial, offered with the professional smoothness of someone who does not discuss their internal state, or an acknowledgement so qualified as to be functionally a denial. He gave me neither. "When?" I said. He picked his answer carefully, the way you pick the right word when the wrong one would misrepresent something that matters to you. "Day 3, he said, when I heard the audio from the corridor outside the meeting room. When I understood what the conversation was about and who it was about. He paused. "Petra Graves has been in the program for 4 months. She is very good at what she does. She is not trained for the situation that was being planned for her, and she was not aware it was being planned. That was the moment I felt something that you might call afraid." "For her," I said. "Yes," he said. "For her." I thought about what the Undersecretary had told the High Arbiter. He knows her coffee preference, and her primary research interest, and the name of her youngest sibling. He knows those things because knowing them is part of what makes him settled in her vicinity. She is not a protectee, she is a person. "And the corridor itself?" I said. "No," he said. The answer was immediate, not rehearsed. By then the decision was already made. Once the decision is made, there is nothing left to be afraid of. You are just doing the thing you have already decided to do. Most people feel fear during the doing, I said. Most people have not had time to finish deciding before the doing begins, he said. Fear is the system asking for information you do not yet have. If you already have it, the system does not need to ask. I was quiet for a moment. Around us the bay was busy and loud, and neither of us was affected by it. "You came here carrying nothing," I said. 12 days in a room with 47 civilizations, some of whom have contested history with your people. A direct physical confrontation on the 7th day, and you are leaving the same way you arrived. He looked at me with the expression that, in 12 days, I had never found a clean word for. "Yes," he said. "Does it ever get heavy?" I said. "Carrying what you carry, the thing that is not a weapon, but that the galaxy is slowly learning, is more significant than most weapons." He thought about that. He thought about it the way he did everything, thoroughly, without rushing, with the stillness of a person who has decided that this moment is worth the time it takes to occupy it honestly. "Sometimes," he said, "not in the way you might think. It is not heavy in the sense of weight. It is heavy in the sense of responsibility. Because the thing you are describing is a capacity, and capacities are not neutral. They mean something. They carry obligation. He looked at the viewport at the far end of the bay, where the stars were very clear. We are built for this. Humans are built for this. 200,000 years of being the kind of animal we were, and then deciding, slowly and imperfectly, and with a great deal of effort and a great deal of failure, to be something different on top of it. Not instead of it. On top. The old thing is still there. It does not go away. You learn what it is, and you train it, and you direct it, and you remain responsible for it. He looked back at me. The galaxy has spent 100 years assessing our warships, and our technology, and our trade networks. I understand that. Those are the things that are visible. But this is what we actually brought with us when we came out here. This. He gestured, briefly, at himself, at his empty hands, at the space between us. We brought this first, before any of the ships, before any of the technology. When the first humans looked up at the sky and decided it was a direction to go in, this is what they were, and this is what we still are. Everything else is supplemental. I did not have an answer for that. I am not sure there was one to have. He picked up his carry case. He looked at me one more time with the full, calm, complete attention that I now knew to identify as, I am present. I have decided you matter. I am giving you everything I have. Thank you, he said, for doing your job well. It made ours easier. He walked to the shuttle connection and did not look back, and I stood in the departure bay and let the noise of it wash over me, the equipment and the staff, and the departing civilizations taking their accumulated weeks of diplomacy home with them, and I thought about the word he had used. Supplemental. The warships were supplemental. The technology was supplemental. The trade agreements, and the political frameworks, and the carefully worded treaties were supplemental. Useful. Necessary. The accumulated result of a civilization's work, but supplemental. The thing that was not supplemental was what 6 people in plain dark uniforms had carried through our gate 12 days ago in their empty hands, and what they had carried it with, and what it meant that they were still carrying it, unchanged, as they walked onto a shuttle and went home. I stayed in the departure bay longer than I needed to. The last shuttle sealed its connection, and the bay went quiet, and I stayed for a few minutes after that, looking at the empty dock where the human shuttle had been. Then I went to file my closing report. I wrote it as I write all my reports, precisely, in the professional language I have spent 22 years developing, with correct citation of all relevant procedures and accurate accounting of all relevant events. It took 2 hours. It was thorough. It covered everything that a closing report should cover. And then I wrote, at the very end, in the section marked, Additional Observations from the Attending Protocol Officer, a single paragraph that I have never written anything like before, and am not sure I will have occasion to write again. It said, the human delegation's presence at this convocation produced an effect on the proceedings that is difficult to quantify in standard protocol terms, but that was observed and documented by multiple independent parties across the 12-day event. The effect was not produced by any action taken in the formal sessions, nor by any official diplomatic position adopted by the delegation. It was produced by what the delegation's protection personnel were, in the rooms they occupied, and the corridors they walked through, and the conversations they had, and the moments they declined to have. This observer's assessment is that the Galactic Council should consider carefully what it means to have human representatives attend future events. Not because their presence poses a risk, but because their presence is, in a way that we do not currently have good language for, an argument. An argument that the most significant thing any civilization can bring to a room is not what it carries, but what it is, and that those two things, over a long enough timeline, and with a sufficient commitment to the difficult work of understanding the difference, need not be in conflict. I saved the report. I sent it. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in 12 days, which surprised me. I had expected the questions to keep me awake. Instead, I found that the questions had, somewhere in the preceding hours, resolved into something quieter than questions. Something that did not require answers, because it was not asking for them. Sergeant Nathan Cole had stood in a departure bay and looked at me with his full, settled, already decided attention, and had told me that fear was the system asking for information you did not yet have. I had enough information now. I did not have all of it. I was not sure anyone outside the Human Confederacy's classified archives had all of it. But I had enough. Enough to understand the shape of the thing, if not every detail of the interior. And the shape, I found, was not frightening. The shape was, in its way, the oldest and most straightforward thing in the world. A species that had faced everything its world had to offer, and survived it, and then made a deliberate choice, over generations of slow and painful and never finished work, to direct that survival towards something other than destruction. The capacity was still there. It had never left. It could not leave. It was the bone of the thing, the structure beneath everything else. But the direction of it had changed, was changing, had been changing, imperfectly and inconsistently, and with all the difficulty that real change always carries, for as long as humans had been capable of choosing. 6 people with empty hands, standing between the galaxy and whatever came next. Not because they were told to, because they had decided to. Because Petra Graves was a person who mattered, and the work she was doing mattered, and the future that the convocation was trying to build mattered, and they had looked at all of it and decided it was worth what they carried, which was everything they were, and nothing more, and nothing less. I thought about that for a long time, lying in the quiet of my quarters with the station turning slowly outside, and the stars very steady in the dark. Then I thought about what Nathan Cole had told me about wolves, about the 2 at the rear maintaining elevation and sight lines, about the unhurried, measured pace, about the outcome that was not in doubt. I thought about 6 human beings, traveling home now through the dark between stars, heading back to wherever home was for each of them, and I thought that wherever they went next, the galaxy was going to feel them arrive the same way it had felt them arrive here, not because they announced themselves, because they were already ready, for everything, before the door opened. And the door always noticed. I want to record one final thing, because I believe records matter, and because this one belongs in the permanent account of what happened at the convocation on Nexus Station. On the day before the final departure, while the closing sessions were wrapping and the logistics of dispersal were beginning, I happened to be in the observation corridor adjacent to the station's small public garden, which is a compact pressurized space filled with plant life from several member worlds, maintained as a gesture toward the idea that civilizations can share a living space without the things in it needing to compete. It is not a large space. It is peaceful in a way that the rest of the station rarely is. Petra Graves was in the garden. She was sitting on one of the low benches near the far planter bank, reading something on her data slate, looking the way very young people in demanding professions look when they have been given 30 unscheduled minutes and have decided to use them honestly, for themselves. Owen Briggs was standing near the garden entrance, not inside it, at the threshold, in the position that gave him sight lines to both the garden and the connecting corridor. He was reading something too, or appeared to be, though I noticed that his page did not turn for the 18 minutes I was in the adjacent corridor. He was not watching her the way a guard watches a protected party. He was not watching her with the active, evaluated attention he brought to every room during formal operations. He was watching her the way you watch something you are responsible for that is, in this moment, perfectly fine, and you know it is perfectly fine, and the knowing of it is itself a kind of rest. At one point she looked up from her slate, noticed him, and raised a hand in a small wave. He raised one back. She returned to her reading. He returned to his unturning page. That was it. That was the whole exchange. I moved on. I had work to do, but I thought about it for the rest of that day, and I am thinking about it now. Settled. That was the word Undersecretary Cole had used for what the program produced. A settled person has assessed their environment and made peace with what they found in it. A settled person is not afraid, because they have already answered the questions that fear uses to operate. Owen Briggs, standing at the garden threshold with his unturning page, watching Petra Graves read in the quiet of the only patch of living things on the station, was the most settled being I had encountered in 12 days. Not because nothing could happen, things could always happen, but because he had, in advance, answered the question of what he would do if they did, and the answer satisfied him, and so the present moment, in which nothing was happening and a young woman he was responsible for was resting in a garden, could be received fully for what it was. Good, simple, sufficient. That is what I walked away with from the 12th most important conversation of my career, and from the 12 days that surrounded it, and from the 6 people in plain dark uniforms who had walked through our gate with empty hands and changed, in ways I am still measuring, how I understand what it means to be ready for something. Not the readiness that keeps you rigid, not the readiness that requires a weapon in hand, or a plan for every scenario, or a controlled perimeter at all times. The readiness that comes from having done the work so thoroughly that the work is finished, and what remains is just you, in the room, already knowing what you are and what that is worth, and able, in that knowledge, to simply be present. To hold an unturning page in a garden entrance and watch someone rest. To carry everything in your empty hands. I filed the last of my closing reports on the morning after the departures, and went to find Drick 7, who was eating spiced grain again in the staff corridor, as he usually was when there was nothing immediate requiring him. I sat down across from him and looked at the wall for a moment. "How do you feel?" he said. I thought about it genuinely, the way I had learned, over 12 days, to think about things, thoroughly, without rushing to a conclusion I had not yet earned. "Like I need to reread some things," I said. "Like some of what I thought I understood was right, for the wrong reasons. And some of what I thought was obvious turns out to be much harder than it looked." He considered this while eating his grain. "That sounds like a lot of work," he said. "Yes," I said, "it does." He offered me some of his grain. I declined, as I always did, and he was unsurprised, as he always was, and we sat together in the quiet of the post-event corridor, while the station began its return to ordinary operations around us. And somewhere beyond the viewport, moving through the dark between stars, 6 humans were going home, carrying themselves and nothing else, and the galaxy they moved through was a little different than it had been 12 days ago, and I thought that was probably how it always went, when something true arrived in a room, and the room had the sense to pay attention. You do not always notice it happening, you notice it after, in the quality of the quiet it leaves behind.